The Fly on the Ceiling, written by Dr. Julie Glass. This story is a story that is going to help you understand coordinate graphing. And the story is of a guy who lived a long time ago. He lived in France. He was a French guy, so he had a French name. His name was Rene Descartes. This may sound like a funny name to you, but in France, it's perfectly normal. Rene was a philosopher. A philosopher is someone who thinks about why things are the way they are. Rene was a great philosopher. Many of his ideas are still famous today. I think, therefore I am. I think. But even though Rene was a great philosopher, he did have one problem. He was messy. This problem started out small, but it got bigger and bigger. The funny thing was Rene did not know he had a problem until he started to lose things. His notebook, his favorite hat, his book about stars, his inkwell. Then he found the inkwell. Uh-oh. Now Rene knew he had a problem. It took him a moment to find his coat, his hat, and the front door. Rene went to his favorite bakery to buy a fresh loaf of bread. Then he headed to his favorite place to think, the banks of the River Seine. Rene ate some of the bread while he walked. He looked at the water and wondered how he could keep better track of his things. Night fell and Rene was still thinking. He was thinking so hard that he didn't look where he was going. Splash into the river Rene Descartes. When he was fished out of the water, he was cold and wet, and his bread was soggy. Rene walked home. By the time he got there, he was sneezing and wheezing. He crawled into bed and fell fast asleep. The next morning, Rene still felt dreadful. Not only that, he couldn't find a handkerchief, or an extra blanket, or the logs to make a fire. He couldn't even find his soggy bread, which would have dried out by then. Rene crawled sadly back into bed. He stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was the only place in his room that wasn't messy. Rene wished that he lived on the neat ceiling instead of on the messy floor. Just then he noticed a fly on the ceiling. The fly flew off and landed near one corner. Then it flew off and landed in another corner. Then it landed above Rene's toes. Then it stopped right above Rene's head. Rene started to think. He wondered if the fly ever landed in the same place twice. This might seem like a weird thing to think about, but Rene was a philosopher, so it was normal for him. I need to record where the fly lands so I know how many times it lands in the same place, he thought. But how can I do that? Rene thought and thought. Suddenly he had a brilliant idea. It was so brilliant that he jumped out of bed and did a jig. He knew how to record exactly where the fly landed on the ceiling. Rene took a piece of charcoal from the fire. Then he climbed up on a chair and started drawing lines on the ceiling. Don't try this at home. Your parents wouldn't like that. First, Rene drew lines from the north wall to the south wall, so up and down. Then he drew lines from one side to the other. Then he numbered the lines along two of the walls. After that, he got back into bed. So you can see he's creating a coordinate grid. Rene watched the fly on the ceiling. When it landed, he counted the lines over to that spot. He wrote down the number of lines, 2. Then he counted the lines up to that spot and he wrote down the number 5. Together, the two numbers, 2 and 5, told him exactly where the fly was. The numbers 2 and 5 are called coordinates. The first coordinate, 2, measures how far away the fly is from the left side. The second coordinate, 5, measures how far away the fly is from the bottom wall. So you can see the fly flew over 2 over and up 5. Renee spent the whole morning watching the fly and sneezing. If you had gone to visit him, he might have said, "The fly is over 6, or 6 over and 3 up, 6, 3, or the fly is 4 over 7 up, coordinates of 4, 7, or the fly is 8 over and 1 up." Every spot on the ceiling had its own set of coordinates. Recording the coordinates of the fly over and over gave Renee another brilliant idea. Maybe he could keep track of his stuff the same way he kept track of the fly. It would be even easier because a hat can't get up and fly away. Renee jumped out of bed again. He pushed everything into the kitchen. Now the floor of his room was as clean as his ceiling, but he couldn't draw the grid on the floor with charcoal. It would rub off too soon. Renee went next door to see if his neighbor had any paint. What luck, his neighbor was a painter. And there they go, painting the floor. Then they went to the bakery to buy bread. By the time they got back, the paint had dried. The painter helped Renee put his things in place on the grid. They found Renee's hat, his star book, his quill pens, his old boots, his journal from when he was 10, and many things that Renee didn't even know they were missing. On a chart, Renee carefully recorded where everything went. Voila! So you can see his books are at 4, 4, his star book is at 4, 5, the cactus is at 3, 8. After that, Renee's home was never messy again. Well, hardly ever. Renee's system caught on around the world. It was called the Cartesian coordinate system. Cartesian comes from Renee's last name, Descartes. Today, people still use the Cartesian coordinate system in many different ways. Okay, so maybe Rene Descartes wasn't really messy, and maybe he really didn't fall into the saying or draw lines on a ceiling, but even if nobody knows exactly how he did it, it is a fact that Rene Descartes made the Cartesian coordinate system very popular, and he was a darn good philosopher too.